Welcome to Spotlight Chronicles, everyone. I'm so glad you could join us for another deep dive. And of course, we'll be speaking nice and clearly for our listeners all over the world. I hope we appreciate you guys. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Isabel Allende's The House of the Spirits. Specifically, we're going to be examining what we can learn from this review we have of the book. And you know what? It really got me thinking about what people are actually looking for when they read a review like this one.
Well, it's interesting, because the review doesn't just sort of rehash the plot. It seems to be speaking to someone who's looking for a little more than just the basic summary, Like maybe they want to understand the context better or the historical parallels, or even just get a little taste of Allende's magical realism.
Yeah, you're right. It's like they're looking for a deeper understanding, not just a quick overview.
Exactly. And, speaking of a deeper understanding, the review itself has some really interesting things to say that I think would really enhance any blog post about this book. Like, for example, it mentions this theme of recurring violence within the Trueba family.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about the sins of the fathers, right? The review doesn't just mention it. It highlights how Estebán Trueba's actions end up directly impacting future generations. Like it's some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of conflict and pain.
Exactly. And I think that's where a blog post could really, dive a little deeper and explore specific examples from the book, like how Estebán is so ruthless towards the peasants working on his estate. And that ultimately leads to his granddaughter Alba getting involved in the revolutionary movement. And you can really see how that cyclical pattern of violence plays out.
That is such a great point. It's not just an abstract idea. It's woven into the very fabric of the story. And there's this other element, too, that I find so interesting, the magical realism. The review touches on it, but I really think that a blog post could expand on how Allende uses magical realism in a way that's really rooted in Chilean culture and history.
Oh, absolutely. The review only briefly mentions Clara's clairvoyance and all the spirits, but, you could go so much further and explore how these things are connected to the indigenous beliefs and folklore that were suppressed during the dictatorship. It's like she's reclaiming these elements and weaving them into a narrative that challenges the dominant historical narrative.
Almost like she's using magical realism as a form of resistance, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. It's a way of saying, this is our history too, and it deserves to be remembered. And, the review also touches on the feminist aspects of the novel, which is another area a blog post could really explore.
Oh, definitely. It mentions this idea of feminist satire, but I think a blog post could delve into how Allende uses humor and sometimes even exaggeration to critique the patriarchal structures of Chilean society. It's not just about pointing fingers, It's about making us laugh at the absurdity of it all.
Exactly. And it's through that humor that she really makes such a powerful statement about the strength and resilience of women. Like, just look at how Clara navigates the constraints of her world with such wit and a little touch of magic. It's not a simplistic portrayal of victimhood. It's showcasing the agency that women possess even within these really oppressive systems.
It's interesting how the review kind of touches on all these different layers without going into too much detail. It's like a map that highlights all the key landmarks, but then it leads the actual exploration up to the reader.
It really is, and that's what makes it such a great starting point for a deeper dive. It piques your curiosity, but it doesn't spoil the journey.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Now, for anyone out there who hasn't yet had the pleasure of reading The House of the Spirits, let's just take a quick look at the basic premise.
Okay, so the story unfolds across multiple generations of this family called the Trueba family, and it's set against this backdrop of a country undergoing immense political and social change. While Allende never names the country specifically, many people interpret it as Chile, given her own personal history.
Right. And at the center of it all is Estebán Trueba, the patriarch of the family. Mm-hmm. And his actions kind of reverberate throughout the lives of his children and his grandchildren. The review describes him as a force of nature, which I think is an interesting way to put it.
It really is. Because a force of nature can be both beautiful and destructive, life-giving and devastating. And that's the duality at the heart of Estebán's character. He's complex, capable of great love, but also terrible cruelty.
Exactly. He's a man who's so deeply rooted in tradition, yet his choices often lead to these unintended consequences that end up challenging those very traditions.
Yeah.
And this is where that theme of fate versus free will starts to emerge, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, the review kind of hints at it, but I think a blog post could really explore how the characters, and Estebán especially, grapple with the forces that seem to be shaping their destinies. Are they really just puppets of fate, or can they break free from these predetermined paths?
And then, of course, there's the question of political oppression, which is woven throughout the whole narrative. The review draws these parallels between the fictional events of the book and the very real political turmoil of 1970s Chile, particularly the rise and fall of Salvador Allende.
The impact of the dictatorship on Chilean society, and really how Allende uses fiction to reimagine and reframe those historical traumas.
It's like she's giving us this whole new lens through which to view history, one that blends the personal and the political, the magical and the real.
Exactly. And it's through that blend of elements that she creates this story that's both deeply personal and universally resonant.
Now, one thing that really stuck out to me in the review was how it highlights this recurring motif of the daughters falling for these rebellious young men who challenge Esteban's authority. What do you think is the significance of that?
I think it's such a brilliant way for Allende to explore the clash between tradition and change, the old order versus the new. Each generation of daughters represents a push against those patriarchal constraints that Esteban embodies. They yearn for a different world, a world where they can define their own destinies.
So it's like each love story becomes this mini rebellion, a microcosm of the larger shifts happening around them.
Exactly. And those love stories, even amidst all this political turmoil, they remind us of the enduring power of human connection and the yearning for freedom in all its forms.
Speaking of freedom, the review doesn't shy away from addressing the darker aspects of the story, the violence and oppression that permeate Chilean society. It's a reminder that even in a world touched by magic darkness, can still cast a pretty long shadow.
It can. And this is where Allende's skill as a storyteller really shines through. She doesn't sugarcoat the brutality of the dictatorship, but she also doesn't let it completely overshadow the resilience of the human spirit. There's this constant interplay between darkness and light, despair and hope.
It's like she's saying, yes, the world can be a complex and often brutal place, but there's always that potential for beauty, for love, for resistance.
Exactly. And it's that glimmer of hope that makes The House of the Spirits such a powerful and enduring work. It reminds us that even when faced with immense suffering, the human spirit can not only endure, but thrive.
And it's through that endurance, that refusal to be silenced, that the cycle of violence can finally be broken. So before we go any further and dive deeper into all the themes of the characters, let's pause for a moment and consider this. What advice would you give to someone who's about to read The House of the Spirits for the very first time?
That's a great question. I think the most important thing is to approach the novel with an open mind and be willing to embrace the magical realism. Don't try to overanalyze it or rationalize those fantastical elements. Just let them wash over you. Let them transport you to a world where the lines between reality and imagination are blurred, like you're stepping into a dream where anything is possible. And that's part of the magic of Allende's writing.
I love that analogy. It really is about surrendering to the experience, letting the story unfold on its own terms. But I can imagine that some readers might find the scope of the novel a little daunting. It spans decades and multiple generations. It weaves together personal stories with historical events.
Yeah, you're right. It's a pretty dense and layered work. That's why I would also suggest paying close attention to the recurring symbols and motifs that Allende uses. Think of them as these threads that connect different parts of the narrative and add all this depth and richness.
So like breadcrumbs leading us through the forest of the story.
Exactly.
Can you give me an example of one of those symbolic threads?
Oh, absolutely. Take the house itself, for instance. It's not just a setting. It's practically a character in its own right, It evolves alongside the family, reflecting their hopes and dreams, their traumas and secrets.
It's almost like this living, breathing entity that's witnessing all the family's joys and sorrows, their triumphs and their failures.
Exactly. And then you have these recurring images of birds representing freedom and escape. And then you have the colors green and white, often associated with Clara's spiritual presence and the enduring strength of women.
Like a secret language woven into the very fabric of the story, just waiting to be deciphered.
Precisely. And, as you start to decode those symbols, you'll find yourself drawn deeper into all the thematic complexities of the novel. And one of the most prominent themes, as we touched upon earlier, is that of family legacy and the sins of the fathers.
Right, that whole idea that our past, both personal and collective, shapes who we are and the choices that we make. The review mentions Esteban's, those harsh actions having these lasting consequences for his family. But I think a blog post could really unpack this with specific examples.
For sure. Think about how Estebán treats Pedro Tercero, his illegitimate son, that he refuses to even acknowledge. That act of denial and cruelty, it all comes back to haunt him later on when Pedro Tercero becomes this revolutionary leader challenging everything that Estebán's world stands for.
It's like this boomerang effect. His actions, which are rooted in this desire to maintain control, ultimately lead to rebellion and chaos.
Exactly. And that cycle of violence repeats itself in other ways throughout the story, showing just how deeply entrenched these patterns really are. But it's not just about highlighting the darkness, it's about exploring the possibility of breaking free from those cycles.
Which is where the theme of fate versus free will comes in, right? To what extent are the characters truly in control of their own destinies?
That's one of the core questions that the novel grapples with. On one hand, there's this sense of inevitability, this feeling that history and family patterns just dictate the course of events.
Like they're trapped in a web they can't escape.
Exactly. But at the same time, you have these moments of defiance, moments of choice, where characters make decisions that challenge those predetermined paths. Think of Alba, for instance. She's born into this family that's marked by so much violence and political turmoil, yet she chooses a path of resistance and ultimately forgiveness.
It's like she's saying, I won't be defined by the past. I'm going to choose a different future.
Exactly. And that act of choosing, even within the constraints of her reality, is what makes her such a powerful and inspiring character. It really speaks to the enduring human spirit, that capacity to hope and strive for something better, even when the odds are stacked against you.
Which brings us to another really important theme, the political oppression that just permeates the whole narrative. The review makes it very clear that Allende is drawing these parallels between the fictional world and the real political events of 1970s Chile.
Absolutely. Exploring the rise of Salvador Allende and his socialist reforms, the growing political polarization in the country, and of course that U.S.-backed coup that led to Pinochet's brutal dictatorship.
It's like having a map to help you navigate the historical landscape of the novel. It helps us understand the weight of those events, the fear and uncertainty that just kind of hangs over the characters' lives.
Exactly. It grounds the story in a reality that for many Chileans was all too real and incredibly traumatic. It also highlights Allende's courage, in using fiction as a way to confront these traumas and give a voice to those who were silenced and disappeared.
Like she's saying, we will remember. We will not let these stories be forgotten.
Exactly. That act of remembering is so important. It's a form of resistance. It's a way of honoring the victims and holding those in power accountable.
The review doesn't really go into detail about Allende's personal connection to all of these events, but that's something else a blog post could really explore, don't you think?
Definitely. It's important to remember that Isabel Allende is actually Salvador Allende's niece. The coup and the dictatorship weren't just abstract events for her. They were personal tragedies that really shaped her life and, of course, her writing.
And that personal connection just adds another layer of depth and meaning to the entire novel. It's not just a work of fiction. It's a testament to the power of memory and the importance of storytelling as a form of both healing and resistance.
Exactly. And it serves as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can find ways to resist, to create beauty, and to hold on to hope.
Speaking of resistance, the review mentions that recurring motif of the daughters falling for these rebellious young men who challenge Estebán Trueba's authority. Why do you think that pattern is so important?
I think it's a really clever way for Allende to explore those generational shifts that were happening within Chilean society. Each daughter's love story becomes this microcosm of the larger struggle between tradition and change, the old guard versus these emerging forces that are trying to dismantle it.
Each love story is like a mini rebellion, a challenge to the patriarchal structures that Estebán represents.
Exactly. And, even amidst all the political turmoil, those love stories remind us of the enduring power of human connection and that yearning for freedom in all its forms.
That's beautifully put. It's like she's saying, even in the midst of all this darkness, love can still bloom and hope can take root.
Exactly. And that's what makes The House of the Spirits such a powerful and enduring book. It's a story that acknowledges the complexities of history and the resilience of the human spirit. And it reminds us that even when faced with immense suffering, there's always the possibility of love, of resistance, and of hope.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
Right.
From the intricacies of the plot to the really profound thematic depths.
Yeah.
But it feels like we've only scratched the surface of this incredibly multifaceted novel. What other advice would you give to someone who's eager to delve deeper into this world?
One of the most rewarding parts of reading The House of the Spirits is really engaging with Allende's masterful use of magical realism. And my advice would be, don't shy away from those elements, embrace them. Let yourself be transported to this world where spirits roam freely, where clairvoyance is a gift, and where the lines between the living and the dead are blurred.
Like stepping into a dream where anything is possible.
Precisely. And as you journey through this dreamlike world, pay attention to those little nuances in Allende's writing. The vivid imagery, the lyrical prose, the way she blends humor and tragedy, the personal and the political. All of those details are what bring the story to life.
It's like she's weaving a spell with her words and drawing us into this world that is both familiar and completely fantastical.
Exactly. And as you become more immersed in that world, I encourage you to consider the different perspectives of all the characters.
Right.
You know, the novel is told from multiple points of view, which allows us to see the same events unfold through the eyes of Estebán Clara, their children, and even some of the minor characters.
So it's like we're given this kaleidoscope of viewpoints.
Yeah.
Each one offering a slightly different angle on the same event, challenging us to question our own assumptions and biases.
Exactly. And through those multiple perspectives, Allende paints this complex and nuanced portrait of a family, a country, and an era that's marked by both beauty and brutality. It's a story that will stay with you long after you finish the last page.
Well said. So for anyone looking for even more insights into the House of the Spirits, what other resources would you recommend?
Well, I always recommend exploring other works by Isabel Allende. You know, she often explores similar themes of family and history and social justice, but each novel has this unique perspective and a different flavor of magical realism.
It's like tasting different spices in the same delicious dish, each one enhancing the overall flavor.
Exactly. And for those who are really fascinated by the historical backdrop, I highly recommend checking out some historical accounts of Chile during the 20th century. There are so many books and documentaries and articles out there that go into the rise and fall of Salvador Allende, the brutality of Pinochet's regime, and that long and difficult road to democracy.
So it's like having this guidebook to the historical terrain that inspired Allende's work, right? It helps to enrich your understanding of the novel's political and social context. And what about for those who are new to magical realism as a genre? Are there any resources you'd recommend for them?
Oh, there are some fantastic books and articles out there that explore the history and theory and practice of magical realism. You know, authors like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Laura Esquivel and Salman Rushdie, they're all masters of the genre, and their works provide these fascinating insights into how magical realism can be used to explore these profound truths about reality, history, and the human condition.
It's like opening a door to a whole new world of storytelling, where the impossible is possible and where the boundaries of imagination are constantly being pushed.
Exactly. That's the beauty of magical realism. It challenges us to see the world in these new, unexpected ways, to embrace the mystery and wonder that lies just beneath the surface of everyday life.
Now, as we kind of wrap up this section of our deep dive, I'm curious to hear what you think makes The House of the Spirits such an enduring and impactful work. Why do you think it continues to resonate with readers all these decades after it was first published?
I think there are a few reasons for that. First and foremost, it's just a masterfully written story. It's full of these vivid characters and compelling plot twists, and the prose is just beautiful. Allende is such a gifted storyteller, and she has this incredible ability to transport readers to another world and make them really feel the joys and sorrows of her characters.
It's like she weaves a spell with her words, drawing us into a world that's both familiar and fantastical.
Exactly. And then there's the historical and political relevance. As we've talked about, it offers this really powerful critique of political tyranny and social injustice and that cyclical nature of history. These are themes that resonate with readers, especially now when we're still grappling with so many of the same challenges.
So it's a story that speaks to the human condition, to our shared struggles and aspirations.
It does. And finally, I think it's the novel's message of hope and resilience that makes it so enduring. Despite all the darkness and despair that's present throughout the story, Allende never lets us forget about the strength of the human spirit, our capacity for love, for compassion, for forgiveness.
It's not just a cautionary tale. It's a testament to the enduring power of hope.
Exactly. Even in the face of what seems like insurmountable odds, there's always a possibility for change, for redemption, for a better future. And I think that's a message that people really need to hear, especially in times of uncertainty and turmoil.
We've really covered a lot in our exploration of the House of the Spirits. From the magic of Allende's realism to those profound thematic depths, we've journeyed right into the heart of this literary masterpiece. But believe it or not, our journey isn't over just yet. We've explored the novel's themes and delved into its historical context, and even touched upon the magic of Allende's realism. Now we're going to uncover some of those bonus tools that you can use to really enhance your understanding of this incredible book. It's like we're unlocking a secret compartment that's full of these literary treasures.
Oh, I like that. That's a great image. And, you know, one of the most valuable tools is perspective. Remember that The House of the Spirits is told from multiple points of view. So as you read, try to really step into the shoes of each character, even the ones that you might not find very sympathetic.
Yeah, that's such an important reminder. It's easy to get caught up in our own judgments.
Mm-hmm.
You know, especially when we're dealing with a character like Estebán Trueba. But seeing the world through his eyes, understanding what motivates him, even if we don't agree with his actions, it adds this whole other layer of complexity to the story.
Exactly. It's about embracing those gray areas of human nature, recognizing that even flawed characters can have these moments of vulnerability and love and even regret. And, speaking of Esteban, the review mentions the cyclical nature of violence within the Trueba family. But I think a blog post could really benefit from exploring how that cycle manifests in those specific relationships.
Right, like how Esteban's past actions come back to haunt him. Like how his mistreatment of Pedro Tercero, his illegitimate son, actually ends up fueling the very revolution that threatens his world. It's almost like this self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. And a blog post could go into the psychology of it all, exploring how trauma and resentment gets passed down through generations, shaping the destinies of all the characters, like this ripple effect, where every action, no matter how small, has these far-reaching consequences.
It really makes you think about how our choices, both personal and political, have a ripple effect that extends way beyond ourselves. And speaking of choices, the novel also deals with this whole theme of fate versus free will. A blog post could really dig into this and examine how characters like Alba, despite being born into this world of turmoil and these predetermined paths, they still manage to carve out their own destinies.
Oh, absolutely. Alba's story is a real testament to the power of individual agency. The idea that even in the face of a really difficult reality, we still have the power to make choices that shape our lives. And it's not just about these big, grand gestures of rebellion. It's also about the small, everyday acts of defiance, choosing hope over despair, choosing love over hatred.
Like she's saying, I may not be able to control everything that happens around me, but I can control how I respond to it. I can choose to be a force for good, even in the darkest of times.
Exactly. And that message of resilience, finding hope in the midst of all the wreckage, that's what makes the House of the Spirits so enduring and inspiring. And for those readers who are really drawn to the historical side of things, I highly recommend supplementing their reading with some historical accounts of Chile in the 20th century.
Right, understanding the political climate, the rise and fall of Salvador Allende, the brutality of Pinochet's dictatorship.
Yeah.
It just adds another dimension to the story. It's like having this map to navigate the historical terrain that Allende blends so well with fiction.
Exactly. And it helps you to appreciate just how nuanced her storytelling is. You know how she uses real-life events to craft this world that is both fantastical and deeply rooted in historical truth? And for those who are really intrigued by magical realism, I'd encourage them to check out some other authors like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Laura Esquivel.
As the masters, it's like stepping into this secret garden where reality and imagination are all intertwined, where spirits can mingle with the living and where anything is possible.
Exactly. And by immersing yourself in those other worlds, I think you'll gain a deeper appreciation for Allende's style of magical realism, how she uses those elements not just for entertainment, but also to explore these profound truths about human nature and history and the power of storytelling itself.
It's like she's saying, the world is a magical place if you just open your eyes to see it. And, something else that stood out to me in the review was that it doesn't shy away from the darker elements of the story. It acknowledges the violence, the trauma, the political oppression that was so prevalent in Chilean society.
And that's a really crucial element of the novel. Allende doesn't try to sugarcoat the reality of living under a dictatorship, but she also doesn't let that darkness completely eclipse the resilience of the human spirit. There's this constant push and pull between light and shadow, between despair and hope.
And it's that interplay, right? That refusal to let darkness have the final word. It's what makes the story so powerful and ultimately so hopeful. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the House of the Spirits, what is the one thing that you really hope our listeners take away from this?
I think the biggest takeaway is understanding that even in the face of immense suffering, the human spirit is incredibly resilient. We are capable of such love and compassion and forgiveness. And it's those qualities nurtured by memory and fueled by a desire for a better future that have the power to break those cycles of violence and create a world where justice and compassion can prevail.
That is beautifully said.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing your incredible insights. You've been a fantastic guide through this literary labyrinth. And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked a little bit of curiosity within you to explore the House of the Spirits for yourselves. It's a story that really encourages us to embrace the power of memory, the magic of storytelling, and that enduring strength of the human spirit. Till next time, happy reading.